everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors. And this week's contract tip is a follow-up from the last contract tip on the backup contingency exhibit. This week's contract tip is the backup contingency exhibit as written in the RE Forms contract package. So please watch last week's contract tip on the backup contingency exhibit in the GAR forms, even if you are not using those, for a completely thorough explanation of this contingency and what it means. But today I'm going to go over the form in the RE Forms package. So just to back up a little bit, in a market, actually it really doesn't matter the market. If you are working with a buyer or a seller, it is a good idea for a seller to accept a backup contract and for a buyer to write a backup contract. Now, you might hear a seller say, or a listing agent say, oh, we've got several backup offers. Well, that's just not true. I mean, they'll say we have several backup contracts. That's not true. They might have a lot of offers and a lot of interest, but you can only have, a seller can only agree to one backup contract. And the reason is, in the backup contingency exhibit, it references the primary contract. So you can only have one true binding backup. But it is really a win-win situation for both a seller and a buyer in any market, but especially in a fast market where properties are selling quickly with multiple offers. It's great for a seller because if the primary buyer terminates for whatever reason, either they terminate on due diligence or financing contingency or just a variety of reasons, the seller automatically goes to the backup buyer, the backup contract under which they have a binding agreement, and they don't go back on the open market. They don't have to show it again. They don't have to market it again, so forth and so on. For a buyer can have, now a seller can only sell a house to one person at a time. However, a buyer may buy multiple homes at a time. They can buy multiple homes at a time and keep them if they've got the finances. That's typically what investors do. Or a buyer may put an offer in on multiple homes at a time and then terminate if they don't like one or another based on the contingencies within the contract, specifically a due diligence contingency. But regardless, it is with the backup contingency exhibit and the verbiage in that exhibit, it is a win-win for both parties because you can be terminated under no penalty for the buyer, and if the seller goes through with the first contract, then it terminates automatically. So anyway, in the RE forms, it's RE 252 Backup Agreement Contingency Exhibit. And again, you reference the date, you reference the offer date, and you reference the property address. And then again, as I mentioned, a seller can only have one binding backup contract. And here's the reason. It says, it is understood and agreed by the parties that this contract shall be secondary or backup position to a previously negotiated agreement between the seller and blank. And you fill in the name of the buyer, who is the buyer on the primary contract that the seller is in contract with to sell the house. Seller's obligation to sell and buyer's obligation to buy this property is contingent. That means this new buyer is contingent upon the termination of the primary contract, upon the termination before closing of the prior agreement. Seller warrants that seller is not a party to any other contract for sale of the property other than the prior agreement. So again, a seller can only sell a house to one person at a time. Then it states, it's understood and agreed for the purposes of calculating timeframes tied to or based on the acceptance or binding agreement date described in the contract, such as contingency periods or closing date. The acceptance or binding agreement date shall be deemed to be the date on which the seller gives the buyer and or the buyer's agent has received notification that the prior agreement has been terminated. Okay, so what that means, and again, we discussed this with the same is true in the GAR exhibit provisions. You go binding. So a backup buyer and a seller go binding using this backup contingency exhibit. And you fill in the binding agreement date on the purchase and sale agreement on that. However, with respect to the time frames for the rest of the contract, the buyer's right to terminate time frame, the appraisal time frame, the financing contingency time frame, closing date, so forth and so on. Well, the closing date stays the same, but all of the time frames that are timed typically from a binding agreement date in a backup contract, those fall into place when the buyer gets notice that no longer are you in backup position, but the primary contract has terminated and you are now in primary position. Then it says, notwithstanding anything above what we just talked about, the earnest money, however, is due with respect to whatever the parties negotiated with the true binding agreement date. So the earnest money is due when they go binding, but all the other time frames kick into play when this contract becomes primary and not secondary. Buyer acknowledges and agrees that the seller has the right to still amend and amend their primary contract, and that has nothing to do with this backup buyer. And then it says, so here where we go for protection for the backup buyer's earnest money. Prior to receiving notice from the seller that the prior agreement, meaning the primary agreement, has been terminated, the buyer may unilaterally terminate this contract at any time and receive a full refund of the earnest money. In order to do that, however, the buyer and this seller must still use must sign and agree to that under the agreement to disperse trust funds. Then it also says that should the prior agreement close, so let's say backup never becomes primary, the seller closes with the first buyer that they already under contract with, and the property is conveyed to that buyer based on that contract, then this contract, the backup contract, is terminated, and again, the earnest money gets returned to the buyer. This contingency shall be deemed automatically satisfied and terminated on the date on which the seller gives the buyer and or the buyer's agent has received notification that the primary agreement has terminated and is no longer in effect. So again, it's the same provisions as we discussed in the GAR contract, and please cross-reference both videos so you have a thorough understanding. And again, the buyer is in a backup position and they become primary when they receive notice. And again, you must use the proper notice notification forms. That notice that the seller has terminated their primary contract and is going with this backup contract to be the new primary contract that they want to close with this backup buyer, the seller must send notice to the buyer that the primary contract has terminated. You agents, that is not an agent-to-agent email. That is the actual notice form in the contract package sending notice, and it must be signed by the seller. Hope this contract tip helped you out. Definitely take a look at these backup contingency exhibits. Very useful in any market, and especially in a market where we have multiple offers on properties and we have a very fast market where properties are selling quickly. Contracts are also terminating quickly as well. So, but we are getting them closed. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Hey, Gidgy. Hey, Nami. Thank you, guys.